Good morning. I'm George Latimer, Westchester County Executive, and we're here today to talk about a piece of legislation that we have submitted to the Board of Legislators for their consideration, and we hope their adoption. It's a bit unusual because what you're going to see us do, particularly personalized, is to reduce the amount of terms that a county executive can serve in public office. We're watching right now in Washington, D.C., a battle over the relative authority between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And for those of us who remember what we studied in high school and college, the Constitution was constructed with a very delicate balance of checks and balances because the founding fathers understood that we had to have an executive function in a government, but we also had to have an executive function that was held in check in the way that a king was not in their experience with England through the Parliament and other sources. Here in Westchester County, we certainly don't have the same kind of a conflict, but as much as we have had a cooperative relationship between our offices, county executive and the Board of Legislators over these 2 years, the structural reality still exists that the executive, county executive, and you can extrapolate this anywhere else you want to, has certain advantages over a legislative body. And I've chaired the legislature here as well as been in other legislative positions in the state and my local community as well as being an executive now. So I've been a student of this for a long time and a practitioner of it, if you would. And I think what we're watching now is the need for there to be a more robust balance between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And that is the best way to ensure that decisions are made on the broadest possible input and with the greatest amount of thoughtfulness. And when you elect people to a legislature, you usually get a more diverse group of people. Here in this county, our legislature of 17 people currently have 9 women and 8 men. We have 6 people of color out of a legislature of 17. So we have a representative body that looks like Westchester. No one executive can represent more than a handful of those demographics in themselves. But you want the legislative branch and the executive branch to make decisions with some balance between them. An executive has certain advantages, our ability to access the press, the unitary authority that a singular executive has, higher firepower, oftentimes means you can punish and reward in ways that no one legislator can. The fact that the executive's agenda becomes what is discussed and debated by the press. The press, and you've been very generous to follow the things that we try to focus on, and we'll have other announcements later this week. But I think it's important to understand this is the time right now to make this move. We have a good relationship. We're not doing this in a moment of crisis between the two branches. You're dealing with an executive and myself who has served in the legislature, has a sensitivity to the legislature, even as we have not been shy to use our executive authority as we see fit to try to improve things in the county. So what we've done very simply is we have submitted a legislation that will amend the law that was passed about 10 years ago, I think it was 2011, in which term limits were implemented in Westchester County, instituted in Westchester County. The current term limit law as it exists now is that legislators who serve 2-year terms can serve 6 2-year terms, and then at the end of that 12-year period of time cannot seek re-election. The executive law is 3 terms of 4 years of duration, 12 years, and can't seek re-election. This law will change that to 2 4-year terms, and it applies to me as well as to my successors. Oftentimes, when term limits are put into effect, the existing incumbents are grandfathered. So they'll say, well, as it happened in the federal government, when the 2-term limitation for president came in, Harry Truman was president. It didn't affect him personally, but it affected his successors. And of course, since then, Eisenhower, Reagan, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama have all been subject to the 2-term limit. 8 years appears to be the more common time frame for executive limitations. When you look at the governor of New Jersey, the governor of Connecticut, you look at certainly the federal presidency, the New York City laws, although they overrode it once to allow for Mike Bloomberg to serve a 3rd term and for some other legislators to serve it. But I think an 8-year period of time, given the concentration of power that belongs to the executive, is a reasonable balance. And what it does do is it turns over this position structurally more frequently. So if for some reason there are reasons to have a public debate about an issue and it extends over a period of time, it's not necessarily the same executive with that executive's authority that can drive that decision through the system. There are folks who believe that term limits philosophically are wrong, and I understand that's always going to be part of the debate. That debate was resolved in Westchester County in the passage of the law back in 2011. So Westchester County has term limits. This is tightening the term limits on the level of the county executive. But I think this is consistent with things you've seen me do in this administration. We started our term by taking the name of the county executive off all signage for parks and other buildings. That was a statement that I thought was necessary to make because we were trying to redirect the way the county government operates, not around the agenda of a person, but around certain principles that we thought could apply. The way we've worked with the legislature, you've seen us sign bills that the legislature have passed, and we've gone down to the 8th floor to sign it in the legislative chamber to show that this was a legislative initiative, which we are agreeing to, as opposed to the only wise policies come out of what the executive does. And so, as I said, I think this is the right time to do it because we're in a time of harmony, we're in a time of cooperation. We have a budget downstairs that both funds the things that we think are necessary to run the government properly, and we do it with a property tax levy cut. And obviously there'll be changes that the legislature will want to make. We're going to negotiate them through and hopefully come to an agreeable budget that we can sign without having to resort to veto authority. But we'll do this in a way that shows, I think, the path that we'd like to see happen at other levels of government, that there's cooperative government and that we work together between the two branches. May I add that we've also tried very hard to work across the aisle. Now, I'm very well aware of what's happened electorally in Westchester County in the last 3 years. The party that I'm a member of, the Democratic Party, has had a lot of success. But you can't misread that to assume that we have acted unilaterally with that success. We have worked cooperatively across the aisle with the Republicans in local office, municipal office, as well as in the County Board of Legislators. And when these issues come up, we, as an administration, dialogue with the Republican members of the board in the same way that we dialogue with the Democratic members of the board. So this is not something where we have the authority, we have the votes, we're just going to impose it. We have a belief, and I think, frankly, it's true in a lot of areas where we want to work bipartisanly. We want to work across the board. We're willing to listen to and absorb counter-arguments and negotiate through to get to some conclusion. And that, I think, is also what the Founding Fathers intended. I am no constitutional scholar. I've lived a certain number of years. I spent a certain amount of years in public office. And I do believe that what we need right now at this moment in America is the willingness of elected officials to act with some restraint, some self-restraint, and an ability to operate in more of a cooperative and inclusive fashion rather than, I have all the power to do this, so I'm going to do this. When you drive your car every day, you know your car can probably go 100 miles an hour if you put pedal to the metal. Aside from the fact that you'll get pulled over and get a big fat speeding ticket, you know that the road conditions do not allow you to drive beyond a certain speed. And common sense tells you the capacity to go to the maximum is not wise. And there might be a reason if you have to rush somebody to the hospital where you use that capacity, but you don't use the capacity just because you have it. And I think that's true of executive power. If we have a crisis and the executive has to act in an emergency fashion, then you use those emergency powers. But you don't use it in everyday living because what you want is you want a balance. And at the end of the day, you want the people out there who aren't involved in government to see the decisions of government as being rooted in intelligent analysis and also in a cooperative way of getting to the end line. So that is the bill that we put before the legislature. I believe they're going to consider it over the next few weeks. I don't have a deadline by when they would impose it. Obviously, if it's passed by them, I'll sign it into law, and I will be the first but not the last person that will honor a 2-term limit as county executive. Any questions? I'm afraid I put you to sleep on a Monday morning. I'm sorry, Martin, please.
Have you taken the temperature of the legislature?
I've spoken to most of the legislators. We've had some communication. I think there's general support for it. We're not touching legislative term limits in this, and that is to allow a legislator to serve longer than a county executive would serve. So that gives a person a sense that if I have disagreement with this particular county executive, another county executive might yet be in office that I would serve with. So it kind of rebalances a little bit. So I think there's a general support for that. Individual members will take their individual positions on it. I know, a couple of them expressed to me general opposition to term limits. And, I can respect the general philosophy of that. But in this particular case, as I've said, you have term limits in force already. It's only a question of tightening it up on the executive side. So I think there'll be support for it at the end of the day. And I think it'll be bipartisan support. I don't think this is going to break on partisan lines.
Right. And explain why I guess this is being done legislatively rather than to the ballot box? Is there even a mechanism to do it?
Well, it's trickier to do it by referendum. In New York State, there is not a general authority for referendum and initiative as there is in California and a number of other states. There are certain things that will trigger referendums if you bond of a certain amount, if you change the charter of the county in a certain way that might trigger referendum. In this particular case, we turned to our county attorney, and I said, how were term limits imposed initially? And it was by an action similar to the action that we're taking now. So we are amending the law, in essence, in the same fashion by which it was created 11 years ago. Now, you've seen some examples out there where legislators have in the future or have changed the rules for one shot or multiple shot situations, expended the law. No one can close the door for some future change in philosophy if the legislature and the executive chose to change this. So, but it makes it harder to do, and frankly, it makes it harder to do because as an executive, I'm laying out a rationale for why 2 terms make sense. And when I look at all of these, photographs on the wall of the people who've had this job before me, I've known some of them, and some of them are just names in history to me. And many of them have served more than 2 terms. In fact, or have served 2 terms or more. In fact, the number of people who've only served 1 term is only a couple of them up there. But times have changed, and the times that have changed has made the discussion of public policies issues much more robust. Social media, the internet, there's a whole different dialogue about things than was when William Blakely was county executive in 1937. So I think with that type of change in the society, Martin, there's a much greater effort to be out in the community. We spend a lot of time dialoguing out in public. We listen to things, and I think the public expects to see more turnover and more change in order to address the issues of the day.
Most counties in New York don't have term limits for county executives, so you're saying it's just tightening up term limits here, but...
Well, each county makes their own decision, and you're right. A number of counties do have term limits. There's term limits in Suffolk County. There's term limits in Erie County. There are a couple of other counties that have them. Some don't have them. But every county is different in different ways, shapes, and forms. So I can't speak sitting here what Niagara County should do or what Oneida County should do. I think in Westchester, because of the nature of our population, we have a very highly educated, very intelligent population. We have a more diverse county than many demographically. We have more cities in our county than any other county does, which means there are concentrations of attention that go to city government and not to county government. And all of those factors make us unique. Now, there are other counties that are unique in their own way. But if Oneida County or Chemung County, which has county executives, determine they want to make this move, so be it. I think this is what makes sense for Westchester. And the legislature will debate it. There'll be a public hearing on it. People will come in and comment. I'm sure to some extent you'll get feedback in your online versions of the news stories that you file. And we'll see how it goes. But I do think it's rather unique to have an executive, and particularly one that's saying it's going to apply to himself or herself, to say, I think there are restrictions on the power that you've given me, and I'm prepared to lock those controls in place. Any other questions? If not, thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day.